Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
All right. And if anybody wants to move closer to the front so I can hear you, there are some seats here at this central table. There's no need to be afraid. What I'd like to talk with you about today and to have you practice doing is an approach to e-learning design, an approach to instructional design that it's not about tips and techniques to make boring content more interesting. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to go deeper than that and possibly change the way we think about our jobs and our roles. How many here have actually seen my blog entries about action mapping or seen the slideshow, seen another talk? So we've got a few. Also, how many here would define themselves as primarily academic designers, work for academia? So I can assume the rest of you are mostly corporate. All right. Because this approach does apply mostly to corporate training. For academia, I do have people who use it and say that they like it, but it requires a little bit more creative thinking for academia sometimes. And I also want to ask you to just shout out, what is your biggest, most pressing frustration right now with e-learning design? Time? Delivery? Making it fun?
Budget.
Too much content, I think I heard. Budget.
Management who thinks presentations are training.
Management that thinks that presentations are training. Boredom. On whose part? Yours, the learners, everybody. There's also people who have frustrations working with subject matter experts, which if I forget, I might call a SME, S-M-E. Budget, time pressures, lack of the tools that we want to use, all of those really common frustrations. Many of them, I like to think, can be alleviated somewhat with this approach. Certainly not all of them. And I think that also this approach can help raise the profile of learning and development in the organization. Because at the heart of this, we are using this approach to show how our intervention improves business performance. From the very beginning of our design, we're concerned about evaluation and about tracking to business metrics. So I agree with Roger Schenk that we don't learn a lot by listening, so today we're going to do it. And so as of now, we all have new jobs. We are all instructional designers for, let's say, a big network of hospitals. And this hospital network currently has a course on infection control, all of the things that you have to think about when you work in a hospital to keep yourself from spreading infections or catching an infection yourself. The example we're going to use is very basic, a basic compliance course. But the process works for more complex material. We're using this basic course so you can think about the process and not have to worry about becoming a subject matter expert in some obscure content. So welcome to your new job. Our client has sent around to us the original course that they're using now and that they realize is not working. And we have a colleague who's been looking at that course. Let's see what she has to say. Oh. Let's let her sleep this off, and let's just take a look at what she has been looking at. Here's a typical screen from the course. I'll let you read it. And if you can't read it, you can imagine what it says. Here's another typical screen. And after several screens like this, of course, we have a quiz. Because every X screens, we must have something interactive, and what's more interactive than a quiz? So this is all very familiar, I'm sure, and it's an information dump. What the original course does presents a lot of information, somebody has gone to trouble to break it down into little chunks and put headings in and try to make it easy to understand, but basically the course delivers information with an occasional quiz. And although the original designers certainly meant well by presenting all this information, they have had the opposite effect of what they intended. There is so much information in this course that the learners can't process it, nor do they want to process it. So what's another effect of this approach? Everybody knows this. Any ideas? Somebody had mentioned boredom earlier.
People don't pass the test again because they're so busy trying to hold all the information in their heads they don't get the right part.
People don't pass the final assessment because they're trying to juggle way too much information in their heads. It all leaks out. It doesn't change their behavior. Because we'll get there. So I think another common effect of this is passivity and boredom, which is what we're most likely to hear about, and that's why our client has come to us. They say, people complain that the infection control course is boring because, like many clients, our current client does not evaluate the effects of the course. They don't measure whether behavior has changed. What they're hearing from learners is boring. So the designers were well-intentioned. They felt this is important information. They were operating from the very common position that if we get the correct knowledge into people's brains, they will do the right things. But does knowledge always change behavior? If just presenting information with an occasional quiz isn't good, why do we do it? Here's one reason. It's what many people expect us to do. We have this course, could you put it online? We have this information, everybody needs to know, could you put it online and make sure they understand it? 99% of the clients who call me, this is what they're talking, this is how they're speaking, this is what people are telling them to do. The original designers of the course, this is how they were thinking about it. We have a subject to cover. This subject is infection control. The course is therefore going to be all about infection control. And there's a lot of information when you work in a hospital about controlling infections, such as don't overfill the hazardous waste container. Don't put the cap back on a needle. Don't store the syringe by sticking it in the patient's bed, which they actually do. And then to make sure they understand each little bit of information, of course, we have to have a quiz question about it. And as a result of this information-focused approach, here's the menu for the course. The original designers let the information determine the structure of the course. Oh, we have to cover this topic. Let's do a section on this topic. We have to cover this topic. Therefore, there's a section on that. And one thing we, as the redesigners, can notice right away, we're covering both surgical scrub techniques and housekeeping. So we're making the people who do housekeeping also read about how to scrub for surgery. Typical of this course, we have a section for each bit of information. Each section has multiple slides of information. Each slide has a corresponding quiz question. Let's look closer at these types of questions. What do these questions have in common from an instructional design perspective? It's quantitative. They're not being asked to prove what they've learned.
It's all negative case.
It's all negative case. Yeah, there's that too.
Testing knowledge that they don't necessarily need to know.
This is testing knowledge that maybe they don't even need to know. It's not measuring whether they can actually use that knowledge. And what type of knowledge is it testing? It's testing their short-term memory. A few slides ago, remember how we told you that housekeeping staff often get infections? Yes, I remember that. Some reptile part of your brain clicks the correct answer. This is where a lot of the time we are coming from, or people expect us to come from. And where I'd like us to go is here. And like Roger, a memorable experience is what we're aiming for. Clicking in utter boredom through an online course is an experience, but we're not going to remember it. The idea with this process is to create a virtual experience, and I'm not talking Second Life, but even just in the person's imagination, that is memorable, simulates their real life, and teaches them lessons without us having to dump information on them. So I keep saying it should be a memorable experience. Roger covered this morning, but let's review. What are some aspects of a memorable experience? Emotionally engaging, such as emotionally painful, funny, somebody we care about has suffered something. What else?
Reading.
You're doing something, you're not passively being exposed to something. I'm sorry? Failure. And like failure, surprise. So we have a lot of ideas for that. And so as course redesigners, we're going to aim to turn this information into a memorable experience for our learners and ideally change their behavior. So we've invented a fictional clinical staff person named Linda. Linda is about to have a memorable experience. Linda has to give a patient an injection. She goes over to the bed. She gives the patient the injection. And when she's done, she's got this needle exposed, and she realizes that the hazardous materials container where she's supposed to put the needle is on the far side of the room. So she thinks, well, I shouldn't carry this exposed needle across the room. I might trip or whatever. So I'm going to put the cap back on the needle. And she starts lining up the cap with the needle. Suddenly the patient sits up, bumps her arm, her hand slips, and we have this. And as a result of this, Linda has to worry about what she might have caught. The hospital has to run expensive tests to see what she might have caught and may have to give her treatment for hepatitis C, which is a common one. All of this could have been avoided if Linda had followed the proper procedures. Linda actually took that earlier infection control course because every staff member has to take it every year. Obviously, it didn't work. So this is the original approach. We're going to tell them all about infection control. Linda wasn't listening. Let's change it to reflect what we really want to have happen. This is the goal for our project. I keep saying course because that's still what a lot of us develop, but it's sort of shorthand for project, intervention, whatever, because I'm increasingly moving away from thinking a course is the answer. And it could be broken up and delivered in many ways, but let's call it course for now. This process is something that ideally, very ideally, we do with the client, the person who says we need a course, and with the subject matter expert from the very beginning. We get together with our client and our SME, and we say, why are we doing this course? How are we justifying spending, 15,000 pounds or whatever on developing this course? How will the business benefit in a measurable way? Well, we need this course because people are doing risky things. So we need to make them stop doing those risky things. And this was one of the faults of the original course. They thought everybody who works in a hospital is our audience, every single person. We're going to take a little hard-nosed approach to that. And, here we go. We're going to define clinical staff as our audience because their jobs are much different from, say, the housekeeping staff versus the surgeons. So just for the purpose of this workshop, we're going to do clinical staff. So far, we have a specific goal. We want to keep clinical staff from doing risky things that could spread infections. Our client has not been measuring this very well. How could we make this goal measurable? How could we rephrase the goal for our course as something that we could measure? Some sort of change in the percentage of something, or maybe they're counting the number of clinical staff-related infectious incidents, the number of people who have stuck themselves with needles, the number of times that they've had to give a staff member treatment for exposure to hepatitis C. The hospital is counting something, and our goal is to identify what they're counting, identify how they define the problem, and then state our goal in a way that is actually measurable. So I just suggested decrease infection control errors by clinical staff by 20% by 2012, which is probably way too ambitious a goal, but you get the idea. So this might not make much sense to you right now, but if you go through this conversation with your client and you say, really, what are you measuring now that we can use to measure the effectiveness of this intervention we're about to start? What is the problem, very specific problem that you're trying to solve? Because otherwise, we're going to have an information dump. We've gone from information-focused to action-focused, the whole point of this. And because this is extremely crucial and it's the step that most people trip up on, let's practice. Let's say that somebody's come to you and said, we need a course on fire safety. And you say, why? What are you measuring now that shows that there's an issue? What do you want to change? So with our client, how could we rephrase that as a business goal? Reduce the number of fire-related deaths by a certain percent by a certain time, if we're into really smart goals, specific, measurable, actionable, whatever, time-bound. So, yeah.
So what if they really don't mind about the actual change in behaviour? The problem is fire deaths. Actually, we've never had a fire death yet, but we have to prove that we put all our staff through this 20-point multiple choice test at the end and they will pass. What if they really don't care? How do you think about that?
What if they really don't care about having a measurable change in the world, basically?
It's kind of compliance. They just want to make sure everyone's ticking.
They just want to tick off the box. That would be certainly one way to do it, because
I care. I'm the chief executive of a company, so time is money, right? I care how long it takes my people to evacuate the building and get back in after a fire alarm test. Mandatory, have to do them twice a year, and we're on the 8th floor, and all the fanning about that goes on, and then everybody has to go downstairs and get coffee, or if it's lunchtime, so a fire alarm test can take about an hour and a half. At which point, none of my phones are being answered, so I can put on that one there. Time is money. What do I care about? You'll always find something I care about, and you can relate it quite quickly to how much I have to pay for it. How much time is wasted because I paid for an hour and a half salary for 40 people. That's 60 hours of salary that I lost while they fanning about. You see, it's emotionally driven. We did this last week, by the way.
That's a very good point. You keep asking questions, you can find something that they care about and something that obviously they measure and that they definitely care about.
But the point is you marry it with the stuff they've got to tick the box for. So you've got a perfect win-win.
Yeah, you say, we can take care of this issue that you have, and we will also take care of the regulation that says everybody must be exposed to this information. And the goal in doing this, whatever, that's a wild guess. The goal in doing this is to set up a system that the client has bought into and the subject matter has bought into that gets everybody very focused on a specific measurable goal, and that keeps out, therefore, all this information that they don't really need to know. It turns everything into focusing on changing behavior, and it pushes information out to the periphery if it doesn't just exclude it altogether. It's turning e-learning inside out, basically. Here's one. We need a course on how to report child abuse for teachers or for people who work in hospitals. And of course, that's a noble goal. That's a good thing to do for society. But in terms of the business, justifying the expense on the material and what we're going to measure to show that we've succeeded, what would be a business goal for this? Reduce litigation. That's always a good one for a lot of courses. Or if we know that some abused children were not caught by the process, or we've had some false accusations, we could say we need to improve our accuracy to make sure we're catching all the kids that need help and we're not causing trouble where we don't need to be.
You could also head it off at the pass by letting it be known that all of your guys are trained in identifying child abuse, so as a result, the perpetrators are less likely to perpetrate on your turf.
So the goal of the training is sort of a PR thing to show that...
Well, no. Yes. I mean, but you could head off the number of incidents if they know that your site there are experts on your site who are likely to catch them, for example.
So how would we measure that after we deliver the course?
I guess against what the track record was before you delivered it.
This one's a challenge. Diversity. We're all required to do some sort of training in that regard. How can we make that more appealing to everybody, especially our client? What is a measurable change in the performance of the business that could come about through actually effective diversity training? Retention. Retention's a really big one. A really common answer is, of course, avoiding litigation, but I always vote for the retention. And there are also studies that show that a diverse team that works well together produces better results. So if there's a certain result that the business is measuring, like innovation, I don't know how they would measure it, but say they have a measure of that, we can say, hey, we can help you with that through this diversity training, and this is what we're going to focus on. And when we have these kinds of goals, too, we're also thinking in the back of our heads, how are we going to motivate the learners? Because we've identified what the client cares about. That may not be what the learner cares about. But for example, with a diversity course, what would be a way to motivate learners to care? Enjoy better relationships on your team. Get better results from your team. Be part of a very cool company that is succeeding in the marketplace. Things like that. So we've been laboring over step one because it's the most important one. Everything else from this point is downhill. When we get the goal clearly identified and measurable and something that both the subject matter expert and the client agree on, we have already gotten a huge machete and sliced out a huge amount of content that we don't need. You'll see how that works. So this is step one of a 4-step process. And on your tables, you have the world's smallest job aid that summarizes this. If you want to cheat and look ahead, it's on the back of the card, but we're going to walk through it. So what we're doing, and you can see on the card is a little partial view of it, is we're starting to build a mind map, but it's unlike most mind maps, it's highly structured. It's not just a brainstorming, go anywhere sort of thing. But at the very middle is our goal. A lot of people for step 2 would say, okay, now that we know what we're doing, we have to identify what people need to know. And I say, no. We have a goal, and the only way that we're going to reach that goal is for people to actually do something. Information doesn't move you toward a goal. Action does. So back to Linda. What do learners like Linda need to actually do in the hospital on the job to reduce their risk of infection? Ideas?
Consider what they do at the moment.
I'm sorry?
Consider what they do at the moment. So ask them about, say serious questions, say, what would you do in this situation?
No, I mean on the job, not in the training situation.
So that they actually get them to start thinking about what they actually do at the moment to assess the risk.
So encourage them to be more mindful on the job. I'm saying that we're not talking about training activities. We're talking about when Linda puts on her coat and walks into the hospital to do her job, what does she have to do?
Think ahead.
She has to think ahead.
Follow the process.
I'm sorry?
Follow the process.
Follow whatever processes are set up for whatever action she's about to do, such as put the gloves on. This is where we're going. Put the gloves on. When the gloves are dirty, put them in the hazardous materials container. If the hazardous materials container is full, get another one. If somebody bleeds and it spills on the floor, call this person for this sort of treatment. All of those very, very specific behaviors is what we're looking for at this point. Because you and your SME, subject matter expert, are talking about, okay, what is it that people actually really need to do? And in that conversation, you're identifying what are the common mistakes. And that's helping you prioritize the actions that you need to cover. So you get behaviors like this, extremely specific, concrete behaviors that you can observe. There's Linda, who is telling the patient that she's about to give them an injection. She didn't do that. She didn't bring the sharps container to the bedside. So these are specific, observable behaviors. And when we've got them, obviously we have way more than 5 or whatever this is, we put them around the map. So like this is a very specific behavior. Don't overfill the sharps container. Here's another specific behavior. Tell the patient before you give them an injection. Put on your gloves. Each triangle represents a very concrete, observable behavior, and as a result, you have a whole lot of triangles. And every triangle represents a behavior that must happen to reach this goal. It's not a nice to, oh, they should usually do this. It's something that simply has to happen. So we're prioritizing. And as we're thinking about behaviors, we're using this wonderful chart that I stole from Don Taylor and thinking about each behavior. For example, apparently recapping needles is a very common practice, and it's a very wrong practice. Nurses keep doing it, but they're not supposed to. So is the problem knowledge? Do they not know that they shouldn't be recapping needles? Possibly. Is it a skill thing? Are they physically incapable of putting the used needle in the hazardous materials container? It's probably not a skill problem. Motivation. There's probably a motivation problem here because it's more work to put the needle in the container than it is to just stick a cap on it or jab it into the patient's bed, which is another common practice. Environment. Is there an aspect of their environment that's making it hard or reducing the likelihood that they're going to do the right thing? Management doesn't care. The hazardous material container doesn't even exist in that room. Somehow it's gone. So for every action, at least the important actions, it's good to go through this process. Because if, for example, you find out that actually most of the problem is here, there's not much you're going to do with e-learning. And that's when you say to your client, you know, you might want to consider some other changes other than training. Motivation can be handled in e-learning, especially through stories. Certainly not by telling them why they need to do this, but by showing them with stories. So you're making this map with your subject matter expert. You've done these first 2 steps. You've got a goal. You've identified what people need to do. You're itching to, well, the subject matter expert is itching to give you their 183 PowerPoint slides of information. And you say, wait, we have another thing we have to consider. We've identified what people need to do. Let's figure out how we're going to get them to practice it. Because information doesn't change behavior. Doing stuff changes behavior. So for every action, every real-world behavior we have on our map, we're going to brainstorm an activity that we can create using whatever tool that we're using. For the purposes of this exercise, we're picturing a pretty simple online course. But this works also for designing face-to-face training, any blend of these things. So for Linda, we identified these behaviors, these real-world actions that we need them to take. Now, assuming that we're creating an online course-like experience, How can we have the learners practice doing these specific behaviors? Any ideas? You could have a like a virtual treatment room set up where she has to identify the problems that could lead to infection risk, like there's no hazardous materials container, or, okay. Scenario, that's sort of my answer for everything, is a scenario, but they are extremely, extremely useful. Yes? So showing a cartoon character, like doing what Linda just did, and then having the learner draw conclusions from that?
Well, just to emphasize the key points that your reaction point. And another thing you can do, you can have them actually do it on each other, actually doing proper practice with pure water removal.
I like the idea of having them actually do it. I think it's good to have graphics and sort of little stories that show what could happen, but most important is to have the learner make the decisions that are required of them in the real world. And so, oh yeah, let me go back. I've made the assumption that we have a very limited budget, limited technology, and we can only use multiple choice questions. So for our practice activities, no virtual worlds, nothing. We have the multiple choice question, which can actually do an okay job. There are two ways to ask a multiple choice question. There's version A and version B. Read them both and then I'll ask you a question. So from a learning standpoint, a cognitive processing sort of standpoint, what's the difference between these two? B has, well, yeah. Pretend they have the same number of options. I'm sorry. B has less obvious distractors. B has people who have been named. It's a real-life situation. It makes you think of a situation in the real world that you may actually have as part of your job. A is an abstract bit of knowledge, only vaguely related to your job. You can't picture A. B has a character facing a challenge. Yes? That's it. What would happen if we said, you need to pass a scalpel to Sarah? Exact same thing. It's the same setup. It's the same approach. And I actually like the you approach better, because it's more directly involves the learner, because it puts them in the situation in their imagination. I've had clients push back against that, I think incorrectly, because they're afraid that if you say you, and then you, the learner, makes a bad choice, you have made the learner feel bad, and that's a bad thing. I actually think making the learner screw up is exactly what you want to do, and working with your subject matter expert, you identify the most common mistakes, and you practically set it up for the learner to make that mistake so they can learn from it. So maybe this is a common mistake. People in operating theaters without a huge amount of experience have been watching too much television, and they pick option B. They say Bill should pass the scalpel to Sarah by holding it by the neck and putting the handle in her palm, just like in the movies. So we have two types of feedback we could provide. We could say wrong, or we could say 2. So what's the difference, besides 2 being longer? 2 tells a story. Does 2 explicitly tell the learner wrong? No, the learner has to conclude that, which is pretty easy in this case. It shows the consequence. It doesn't tell the consequence. So this is a very simple formula for creating what I call a one-scene scenario. You have a character, or you, the learner, faces a challenge with other people who actually have names and you can pretend exist. You make your choice, and then instead of being told correct, incorrect, you are simply told what happened as a result. And you draw your own conclusions, because that makes your brain work, and it's just like real life. Realistic consequence. So for all of these, this is the real-world action, such as pass a scalpel by putting it in a kidney dish. This is the activity that we've just brainstormed. Bill has to pass a scalpel to Sarah. So for every real-world behavior you want to see, you create, as much as you can with the technology that you have, a sort of virtual simulation of that very specific behavior in which the learner has to think the same way that they have to think in real life. You ask the learner to make a decision just like the decisions they make in real life. They're not regurgitating facts. And you work with your SME, you might find out that, wow, this is a really important one. People screw up on this all the time. So you make a couple of activities that make sure that people get this. So this is starting to look like a mind map. However, the difference that some people are missing is this must feed into the goal. This practice activity is directly related to this real-world behavior. We're not just brainstorming. We're saying every real-world behavior has a practice activity. And for the activities, one easy formula is a character faces a challenge, and then the feedback shows the consequence. And to find out to come up with these ideas for these mini scenarios or these mini situations, subject matter experts are your friend, because they know all the stories, the horror stories. They know the most common mistakes, hopefully. I love asking them about true stories and then having to disguise them. And of course, these questions we looked at, again, we're looking at extremely simple information. If this were more complex, like a course on leadership or something like that, we could go whole hog with these scenarios and make a fully formed, branching decision-making scenario with lots of gray areas and no really true right or wrong, but where the consequence down this path is better than the consequence down this path. So, I said it was a 4-step process. We've identified a goal. We've identified what actions people need to take in the real world. We have brainstormed an activity for each and every one of those actions. Step 4 will make the subject matter expert happy. Finally, we start looking at the information that they might need to know. The trick here is that we're looking at information, only the information that is absolutely required to complete the activity that we've brainstormed. So this means the poor subject matter expert with his 183 slides, they're not going to be used. But ideally, he's bought into this whole process. And he says, oh yeah, this is going to work. And they love coming up with the scenarios. They love participating in that. So hopefully you've got their buy-in by this point. So you're thinking, what does the learner really, really have to know to complete this one activity about passing sharps? Well, the only thing they need to know is to pass a sharp, you put it in a kidney dish. The end. And this approach, having everything have these sort of dependency links, helps you fight this. we should describe all the infection control regulations. Why do we have to do all this? Or the history of hypodermic needles. Because you set up this dependency here, you can say, look, the history of hypodermic needles, however fascinating, is not required information for any of these on-the-job behaviors that we've identified. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on giving that information before you test their knowledge or after? Because it looks as though you tell them on the screen, pass it on to the dish, and then you immediately give them some
No, yeah, that's a very good question, and that's foreshadowing. The question was, are you presenting this information on the screen, such as pass the scalpel using a kidney dish, and then immediately following it with the challenge with Bill and Sarah? And I'm going to say, no. You'll see that in the next couple slides. So we're using this dependency relationship to exclude information that has no real purpose in the real world. Let's look more closely at the information and where we're going to put it. I like to make this very crude distinction between stuff that we learn formally is the stuff that we simply have to have in our heads at all points, at all times. And that is usually just cognitive skills like how to read a map. He does not need to memorize all the roads in Utah or know the history of roads in Utah or know anything else about Utah. All he needs to know is, how do I read a map? So job aid or performance support outside of the course, on the job, the course teaches them how to use performance support. The course helps them learn to think. The outside aid has the information that they're going to be using. And in hospitals, there's a ton of that. Here's this huge poster that is on the wall in every treatment room that tells you step by step, even with pictures, what to do if you get a needle stick injury. And then there's always these signs everywhere, just reminders of what has to happen. So we've already got lots of job aids. And as we're building out our map, we might add little Post-it notes saying, oh, we could use the whatever job aid. Or up there, they need a job aid for that. Let's design one. And the goal here is to get as much information out of the course and onto the job as possible. And a real map obviously is a lot messier. And I have clients that like to do this with online mind mapping software, so it can be more collaborative and they can pass the maps around. So, quick summary. Yeah. Our goal is measurable. It's something that the business cares about. It's something that we can use to evaluate our success, and it's an argument for justifying the existence of the course. It's surrounded by real-world behaviors that people have to do to meet that goal, and only those behaviors, nothing else. Each behavior has an activity in the course that helps people practice it in a realistic way where they have to actually make decisions like they make decisions in the real world. And then linked in some way that we're about to discuss to the activity is the very most minimal information they need for that. So, this would be the traditional approach. Oh, we still have some information. So let's do the traditional thing of present information followed by an activity. And just do that all through the course. I say no. What we're trying to do, remember back at the beginning, we're designing an experience, not information. An experience feels like you're doing stuff. So we have a series of activities. What we're aiming for is a course or whatever intervention that feels like activity followed by activity followed by activity. And if there's information that I don't know that I need to complete this activity, it's available, but it's not presented to me first. We'll see what that looks like. Here's the traditional way. Information, information followed by activity. Here's some information, what you should do and what you shouldn't. And here's a classic quiz question about that information. Here's another way to do it. Imagine that this is like the very first thing in the course. Okay, we have a screen saying, this is the infection control course. Another screen saying how they will benefit by taking this course, why they should care. And then blam, here we are. Magda is in this situation. She has to decide what to do. And again, everybody in the hospital has to take this course. They already work in the hospital. They probably already have an opinion. And in fact, the subject matter expert has told us this is a common mistake. If they cared to know the proper procedure, if they needed more information, we have duplicated the real-world job aid right here in the course. If they click on this, the screen expands and we can see the poster that is probably on the wall right in front of Magda right now, telling her what to do. And I just made all this stuff up. If there were like a needle stick standard operating procedure, they could click on that if they liked. And my fantasy, they could actually click on a human being and maybe chat with them or, God forbid, actually talk to a human being. But let's say we've got somebody who's been working in the hospital for a while, and she says, well, duh, she pours betadine on the wound. Everybody knows that. So what kind of feedback do we present? We show the result. Magda, the betadine did not save Magda from hepatitis C. Clearly the wrong answer, although we don't say that. But in addition, we show them exactly with this arrow saying, hey, you know that poster that's on the wall in every room of the hospital? This is what you should be looking at to find out what to do if you do what Magda did. It would actually be readable in the course. This is just a blurry screenshot. So in addition to showing them the results, we're saying, hey, look at this job aid. So this is a way to have an activity, no information. We didn't present any information before the activity. We immediately plunged them into a situation and had them make a decision. Embedded in that activity is the information they needed, but only if they chose to look for it. This sets them up for failure, which is one thing we want to do because that's what they're doing in the real world. But at least they're learning from their failure here without getting hepatitis. This is a huge, huge point of resistance for a lot of people, especially in compliance courses. We have to make sure that everyone is exposed to all the information because, of course, exposing somebody to information makes them learn. But you'll hear that. So how do you respond to that if you take this approach of making the information in job aids and embedding it? Anybody? What if they choose not to get at it, though? If they get the answers wrong, they are exposed to the information that they are clearly lacking. Or a flip side of saying that is if they do the activities, if they can pass the activities, clearly they know what to do. And that's really all we care about. Are they doing what they need to do? So the activities, carefully designed, should prove whether people know the information. The activities themselves are not testing the information. They're setting up situations in which you apply the information, or they model the behavior that should be happening in the real world, which is you look up the information. Are there any questions on this? This is like, it takes like the glove and turns it inside out. It's the inside-out approach to e-learning. If you're familiar with Michael Allen, it's what he recommends in one, I think his first major book, Michael Allen's Guide to E-Learning. Start with the activity, embed the information in the activity. The information is peripheral. Okay? One common concern is that this doesn't cover every possible situation. You wouldn't have time to design a course that did that and nobody would take it. So what about those situations where somebody makes a mistake and then they say, well, I wasn't trained in that? So one fallback that a lot of clients have used is this needle stick SOP that's linked here. They can say, take this course, and then at the end of the course they say, and now you must read these PDFs that have all the dry information that we didn't bother to design into the course. So that's one way to do it. Because really, if you just really want to expose people to information, if you have an SOP that everybody has to read, just email it to them. And the course here is to make them think, not to give them information. So yeah, if you have somebody worried about every little detail, you say, and then they're required to read every little detail at the end. Yes?
One danger with any kind of multiple choice questions, once one person has done it, they could then pass on the correct answer to somebody else who can cheat their way through. So is it worth coming up with multiple scenarios that be presented at random?
Is it worth coming up with multiple scenarios that could be presented at random to avoid having people who have gone through the course telling the correct answers to others? And if that's a problem in the organization, then yeah, that's what I would recommend. Because in this sort of thing, you can't scramble the answers and have it be effective. Because the situations are memorable, and somebody will say, hey, you know that one with Magda? Don't pour the betadine.
But in a way, aren't you achieving the same result? I mean, they're getting the right answer, whether it's by listening to someone who tells them what to do, or getting information that they've been presented with in advance and actually making the right selection.
Yeah, I'm assuming that we care about whether they've cheated or not, I guess. But that's a good point. You get the same result. I mean, if I take the course and then I tell my colleague, you know, if you stick yourself with a needle in the course, don't pour betadine on it. Instead, you do this other thing. Yeah, they've learned. They just didn't learn through our course. So, yeah, I guess in a way it's a moot question. But if for regulatory purposes you have to, like, track every learner and all of that, it gets messy.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could use the scenarios at the end in a more formal assessment, not give them feedback instead of
Yeah, and I definitely vote for that. For if you are in an organization that needs a formal assessment, if you can't make the actual course the formal assessment, which is the simplest way, then a separate assessment in which the feedback does not, for example, give them the answer in the form of the Sharps poster, is the way to go, because you want an assessment that actually measures whether they will do the behavior. And this, of course, does not guarantee that they will do the behavior, but at least it shows that they are making decisions along the way that you want them to make decisions. Any other questions? Okay. Would you do it the same way with a brand new person who has no experience in a healthcare scenario, because it would be scary for them to maybe make the wrong decision? I personally would, because I think that adults really love to think that they know stuff, even when they don't, and to say, well, I think that's clearly the best way to go, and then, whoops, no. But I think one important aspect of that might be to test it on new people, because if they fail too much, then they're just not going to like the course, and they're going to feel stupid. So you need to, if you have a very new audience, I would have scenarios that are easier, and so they still fail, but they don't fail utterly. But yeah, if you haven't caught that from me, failure is the best way, I think, to learn, and it's fun and effective to set up your learners to fail, and to do that especially for the most common mistakes that the subject matter expert has identified.
But not say fail.
No, but not say fail. Yes, it's in a scenario, and the result shows you, oops, I'm going to go back and do that again. I'm going to do it a different way. And it's, again, we're using really simplistic content here so that we don't have to struggle with the content. In more complex areas, this could become branching decision-making scenarios where there really isn't a clear right or wrong answer. It's only slightly better for Hugh to say this to Sarah than for him to say this other thing. So it doesn't have to be clearly right or wrong. What you're trying to do is to get the learner to think in the way that you want them to think, to make decisions along a certain path. So here's a summary of the process, which is on your tiny job aid there. And that's me. Until tomorrow, I've been tweeting a daily instructional design idea. I have run out of ideas, but hopefully I'll get some more.
Start again.
They won't notice. Yeah, I'll just start recycling them. I have a blog, which has ideas like this had. I have a blueprint, which is an online tool that walks you through this process and also goes into much more depth about the kinds of decisions we as instructional designers have to make about media and formatting of this and should we include that and all of that. We have plenty of time. We've got 10 more minutes, I believe. 5 more? We have 5 more minutes. Any more questions or concerns? Yeah.
You mentioned throughout about talking to a client.
Yeah.
If they push back, not liking that particular idea, how do you challenge that?
If the client pushes back, not liking a certain idea I have?
So if you're setting someone up to fail and they say, oh, we don't like that in our organisation.
Yeah, like the client that says we shouldn't let learners fail because then they'd feel bad. I would push back gently by saying, hey, what do you remember about, what are some of your clearest memories of learning? What are some lessons that you remember most clearly? Just like Roger did this morning. Well, I remember how I shouldn't have done X. Yeah. And try to persuade them that way rather than just... Another way to do it is research shows that, but that doesn't always work very well. And then research is always disagreeing with other research. And yes?
A different way of phrasing it, Cathy Moore, before she retired the blog, said, and there's brain science behind this, but she said that the brain pays more attention to things it doesn't expect.
Yes.
When the learner is just clicking along, getting it right, and confirming what they know, they're not learning anything and they're not going to take it away. It's not so much setting them up for failure as just kind of popping at them and making them think about a decision rather than assuming they know. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so Cathy Moore, when she was still blogging, said that the brain pays the most attention to what it doesn't expect. And I've been harping about failure, but failure is really sort of a surprise. It's what you don't expect. If you're just clicking along, confidently answering all the questions correctly, you're not learning. Something unexpected happens, what you think is correct, strangely isn't. Anything like that will get their brains in gear. Anything else? Yes?
In the example that you gave us with the shops, going to what the lady over there just said, to my mind, putting the lid back on is the logical thing to do because you're protecting the sharp bit. And that's a surprise to me because it's counterintuitive. They do come across things where everybody's been doing something one way for what appears to be a good reason.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly have to do something a different way, which seems odd. Have you any advice about making that more?
I think that's a very good point. The point is that it seems intuitive that if you have a sharp object in your hand and you have a lid for that sharp object, that you would put the lid back on that sharp object. And we're saying, no, don't do that. I think we actually missed an opportunity in our course to have explained, it makes total sense that you'd want to protect that sharp object, but here's why you don't. Obviously, she jabbed herself. That is the reason why, because apparently many of the needle stick injuries occur when people are trying to recap a needle. So we could have added maybe just one line to our feedback. 80% of needle stick injuries occur when somebody's trying to recap a needle. That's why you carry the needle across the room and put it in the hazmat container. So I think that would be one reason, because it's counterintuitive, it's an activity and a behavior that we've highlighted in the course, and we might repeat it a few times. Another thing that they do is they bend the needle. And you can imagine all these things going wrong when you're trying to bend the needle over. Or stabbing it. I love the one where they stab it in the patient's bed. I'll get back to it later. It's like treating the patient's bed as a pincushion. So... I'm certainly going to be around for the rest of today and tomorrow if you have any more questions. I'm happy to hear them.